The gavel struck, and the echo clung to the courthouse like smoke. The narrator said, Maya Collins felt the floor tilt as the verdict cut through her. Daniel Reyes said, breathe. We appeal, we move. The narrator said outside, rain drilled the steps like a warning. Sky Turner said, you missed something, and they know it. The narrator said, a phone vibrated with a number masked by silence. Jonah Patel said, stand down tonight, we regroup tomorrow. The narrator said, Maya traced a scar on her palm, a map back to a night she avoided. Evelyn Drake said, truth is a mirror we tilt, not a statue we worship. The narrator said, an old melody threaded the corridor, familiar as grief. Maya Collins said, Lila, if I move, will you forgive me? The narrator said, a security light flickered, turning faces into masks. Daniel Reyes said, someone wants you rattled, let them fail. The narrator said, in the glass, Maya saw two futures and trusted neither. Sky Turner said, meet me where the river bends, bring courage. The narrator said, thunder rolled, and the night opened its mouth to swallow secrets. The narrator said, the call returned as a message, 6 digits and a time. Maya Collins said, codes belong to people who fear their own words. The narrator said, in the stairwell, footsteps echoed, then stalled. Daniel Reyes said, if they bait you, they want your hurry, not your mind. The narrator said, Maya pictured a sealed letter in a drawer she never opened. Sky Turner said, at the river, answers breathe between lies. The narrator said, Jonah parked 2 blocks away to full danger into distance. Evelyn Drake said, every secret demands a custodian, and payment is always due. The narrator said, lightning flared, revealing the courthouse pores like skin. Daniel Reyes said, we document, we verify, we survive the night. The narrator said, Maya swallowed fear like medicine, and kept walking. Sky Turner said, bring no one who speaks in titles. The narrator said, the alarm panel blinked green, then red, as if deciding her fate. The narrator said, the parking deck hummed with generators and rumors. Jonah Patel said, 2 shadows looped past level 3, and never looked up. The narrator said, Maya counted breaths to 4 and reset to calm. Daniel Reyes said, send me the code, I will triangulate the source. The narrator said she refused, not from pride but from instinct. Sky Turner said, you trust your pulse more than your proof's good. The narrator said, a camera lens above them stared without blinking. Evelyn Drake said, evidence is clay, the sculptor is whoever arrives first. The narrator said, tires hissed through runoff as a black SUV slowed. Jonah Patel said, not ours, keep moving, eyes down. The narrator said, Maya slipped into shadow, letting the rain veil her outline. The narrator said, at street level, sirens stitched a crooked seam through the city. Daniel Reyes said, I filed the appeal notice, we bought time, not safety. The narrator said, a bus shelter poster peeled like a shed skin. Sky Turner said, you still think the verdict was about the case. The narrator said, Maya felt the melody again, the one that wore Lila's name. Evelyn Drake said, some ghosts are administrative, they live in forms and files. The narrator said, a camera in a bakery window mirrored their unease. Jonah Patel said, we split here, triangulate cameras, meet at the bend. The narrator said, rain softened to a mist that still carried weight. Daniel Reyes said, if you see a clean floor, look for the mop, not the miracle. The narrator said, Maya almost laughed, then remembered the scar. Sky Turner said, bring courage, nothing else survives the river. The narrator said, the river bent like a secret folded twice. Sky Turner said, you came alone, or alone enough. The narrator said, willows whispered, and a freight horn pinned the horizon. Maya Collins said, tell me what I missed before the verdict carved it away. The narrator said, Sky placed a damp sketchbook on the railing like evidence. Daniel Reyes said, I am one call away, but make it the right call. The narrator said, Jonah traced a circle on a map in the dark of his car. Evelyn Drake said, when truth arrives, make sure it has proper credentials. The narrator said, Maya opened the sketchbook, and the melody stopped. Sky Turner said Lila did not run. The narrator said, the wind paused as if listening for permission. Maya Collins said, then someone moved her. The narrator said, the night swallowed the answer and promised to return it later. The narrator said, the dawn stretched, thin, painting the river in iron gray. Maya Collins said, Lila's face on that page was no accident. The narrator said, Sky Turner traced her finger across the sketch, each line trembling with memory. Daniel Reyes said, paper burns easily, but truth resists flame. The narrator said, Jonah Patel leaned against the hood of his car, eyes surveying shadows for listening ears. Evelyn Drake said, a storm in daylight is harder to see, but no less violent. The narrator said, Maya folded the sketchbook, holding the weight like evidence. Sky Turner said, someone left it for you, not me. The narrator said, the river hissed as though hiding what it swallowed years ago. Daniel Reyes said, who gains by silence? That is the question. The narrator said, Maya felt the scar on her palm burn, reminding her why she could not stop. The narrator said, the courthouse lobby smelled of polish and tension. Maya Collins said, every file has a missing page, but this one feels deliberate. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes tapped his pen, each strike a heartbeat of control. Evelyn Drake said, control is a theater, and the audience never sees backstage. The narrator said a security guard's glance lingered too long, recording faces like files. Jonah Patel said, we leave no trace, no pause for surveillance to stitch together. The narrator said, Sky Turner scribbled quick sketches of strangers, catching eyes before they turned away. Maya Collins said, these hallways echo louder when lies walk them. The narrator said, lightning outside flared, staining the glass walls in brief violence. Daniel Reyes said, our appeal is fragile, but their arrogance is weaker. The narrator said, the diner hummed with neon and the hiss of grease. Sky Turner said, people talk more when they think no one listens. The narrator said, Maya Collins leaned forward, her reflection fractured in the sugar jar. Daniel Reyes said, whispers here carry weight, louder than the verdict. The narrator said, a waitress refilled coffee, glancing twice as though instructed. Jonah Patel said, check her hands, nervous hands betray rehearsed lies. The narrator said, Evelyn Drake entered, commanding silence without words. Maya Collins said, your presence is too polished for coincidence. The narrator said, Evelyn's smile flicked like a blade, then settled. Sky Turner said, truth feels heavier when it chooses its own chair. The narrator said, the library smelled of paper and dust, knowledge thick in the air. Maya Collins said, old records do not vanish, they are buried. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes traced case numbers with his finger, lips moving silently. Jonah Patel said, timestamps lie less than people do. The narrator said, Sky Turner darted between aisles, pulling clippings with restless speed. Evelyn Drake said, every archive has a guardian, and they fear the living more than the dead. The narrator said, the overhead light buzzed, flickering shadows across their notes. Maya Collins said, this file is older than the verdict, but holds its bones. The narrator said, rain pressed against tall windows, like hands demanding entry. Daniel Reyes said, they erased what linked Lila's name, not her presence. The narrator said, the silence thickened, carrying the weight of ghosts. The narrator said, the safe house smelled of metal and coffee grounds. Jonah Patel said, we hold here until the pieces align. The narrator said, Maya Collins unfolded the sketch again, the lines sharper under lamplight. Daniel Reyes said, this is not a sketch, it is a memory captured. The narrator said, Sky Turner pressed her head against the glass, watching headlights pass like ghosts. Evelyn Drake said, secrets rot faster when hidden in corners. The narrator said, the radio crackled with static, then cut clean as if silenced. Maya Collins said, someone close controls the silence, and that means proximity. The narrator said, the lamp flickered and shadows overlapped too perfectly. Daniel Reyes said, then the betrayal is not future, it is present. The narrator said, the room grew still, waiting for the next fracture. The narrator said, the storm had passed, but the city carried its bruises. Maya Collins said, every drop washed evidence into the gutters. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes unfolded blueprints, edges damp from hurried hands. Jonah Patel said, the CCTV grid has blind spots, each designed, not accidental. The narrator said, Sky Turner pressed her sketchbook flat, adding marks where shadows stretched. Evelyn Drake said, even architecture lies if questioned correctly. The narrator said, the room pulsed with the weight of discovery, fragile as glass. Maya Collins said, we map the silence, we name who profits from it. The narrator said, outside, neon flickered in erratic rhythm, like a failing heartbeat. Daniel Reyes said, their erasure was too clean. A surgeon's hand, not a vandal's. The narrator said, Jonah underlined the grid, circling an address 3 blocks east. Sky Turner said, then that is where the city coughs up its secrets. The narrator said, the warehouse loomed, its corrugated skin scarred with rust. Maya Collins said, a hollow place holds louder echoes. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes adjusted his watch, counting seconds between security sweeps. Jonah Patel said, 3 guards, rotation sloppy, but cameras are precise. The narrator said, Sky Turner crouched near the gate, sketching the timing of footsteps. Evelyn Drake said, a key is only powerful if the door agrees to open. The narrator said, the wind pulled through broken panes, carrying whispers of old labor. Maya Collins said, this place remembers hands that built lies. The narrator said, a truck engine started somewhere inside, its growl a warning. Daniel Reyes said, stay close, shadows will cover only what you respect. The narrator said, the night thickened, sharpening fear into focus. The narrator said, inside, the air reeked of oil and dust. Maya Collins said, the files we need are here, buried beneath noise. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes flicked his flashlight, beam slicing across crates. Jonah Patel said, boxes marked with false invoices, their weight tells truth. The narrator said, Sky Turner climbed onto a pallet, scanning higher shelves. Evelyn Drake said, paper trails are arteries, cut one and the body dies. The narrator said, Maya's hand brushed a folder corner, faint ink smudged with age. Daniel Reyes said, evidence lives longer than memory, but both can betray. The narrator said, a rat skittered, breaking the silence like a gunshot. Sky Turner said, here, initials carved into wood, initials that match her name. The narrator said, Maya froze, pulse racing as Lila's shadow flickered back into being. The narrator said, the sudden alarm split the silence, sharp and merciless. Maya Collins said, we are already exposed. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes grabbed the folder, his knuckles white with urgency. Jonah Patel said, exit left, 15 seconds before the sweep. The narrator said, Sky Turner leapt down, sketchbook pressed flat against her chest. Evelyn Drake said, chaos is useful when you already stand still. The narrator said, red lights pulsed across the ceiling, painting them all in warning. Maya Collins said, we leave nothing behind, not even fear. The narrator said, footsteps clattered, boots heavy on iron grates above. Daniel Reyes said, trust your path, not the noise. The narrator said, the night outside promised danger, but more dangerous was staying still. The narrator said, the alley swallowed them in its wet brick arms. Maya Collins said, what we carry is heavier than chains. And the narrator said, Daniel Reyes shoved the folder beneath his coat, shielding it from rain. Jonah Patel said, we scatter, rendezvous in 30, silence until then. The narrator said, Sky Turner hesitated, eyes flicking to Maya with unspoken trust. Evelyn Drake said, Even separation is a strategy when one watches from above. The narrator said, a black SUV rolled past the alley mouth, tires slicing water. Maya Collins said, if they know, then they already wait for us. The narrator said, rain poured harder, masking footsteps, masking fear. Daniel Reyes said, keep the evidence breathing. We can lose everything else. The narrator said, the alley's darkness closed like a door, but not one they control. The narrator said, the folders spread across the safe house table, pages breathing like lungs. Maya Collins said, these names bleed into each other, threads stitched by intent. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes tapped the corner where signatures repeated with slight variation. Jonah Patel said of forgery, this clean demands insider access. The narrator said, Sky Turner flipped her sketchbook, revealing drawings that mirrored faces on the list. Evelyn Drake said, memory is unreliable, but art tells its own truths. The narrator said, Maya recognized a name that turned her stomach cold. Daniel Reyes said, the verdict was constructed, not decided. The narrator said, rain hammered the roof, each drop a reminder of the urgency pressing in. Sky Turner said, someone close wanted her erased, and they nearly succeeded. The narrator said, Maya clenched her fists, knowing the betrayal was near and personal. The narrator said, the rooftop view stretched over the city, lights blurred by mist. Maya Collins said, every secret leaves a reflection if you climb high enough. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes set up a tripod, lens trained on the courthouse annex. Jonah Patel said, security rotations shifted again, but the timing is too perfect. The narrator said, Sky Turner sketched the skyline, her lines sharp with urgency. Evelyn Drake said, observation without action is voyeurism, not justice. The narrator said, Maya watched the courthouse windows, one of them glowing too long. Daniel Reyes said, that office is the pivot. Everything feeds from there. The narrator said, a helicopter passed low, its searchlight slicing the fog into ribbons. Sky Turner said, then the city itself is the accomplice. The narrator said, the wind lifted papers from the rooftop edge, scattering fragments of truth into the night. The narrator said, inside the annex, the air hummed with electricity and secrets. Maya Collins said, this is the artery, and we are trespassing in its pulse. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes unlocked the cabinet, drawers whispering like confessions. Jonah Patel said, encrypted drives, each labeled with numbers not words. The narrator said, Sky Turner hovered near the door, ear pressed for footsteps. Evelyn Drake said, truth in digital form is fragile, one spark and it dies. The narrator said, Maya slid out a folder marked with initials she knew too well. Daniel Reyes said, cross-check these dates, they do not match the trial logs. The narrator said Jonah pocketed a flash drive, his face unreadable. Sky Turner said, someone is coming. The stairs echo louder. The narrator said, the tension thickened, each breath sharpening into blades. The narrator said, the stairwell thundered with approaching boots. Maya Collins said, we are too late to vanish clean. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes shoved papers into his bag, every second costing more. Jonah Patel said, 2 exits, one barred, one narrow, neither safe. The narrator said, Sky Turner clutched her sketchbook like armor. Evelyn Drake said, the measure of control is not the escape, but how you leave the trail. The narrator said, the red alarm spun, its light slicing across their faces. Maya Collins said, we run not to hide, but to live long enough to finish this. The narrator said, the door burst open, shadows stretched tall across the wall. Daniel Reyes said, follow the noise, not the silence. The narrator said, they moved as one, the evidence burning hot between them. The narrator said, the escape spilled them into the alley, rain falling in silver sheets. Maya Collins said, the evidence survives, but at what cost? The narrator said, Daniel Reyes caught his breath, jacket soaked, eyes still scanning. Jonah Patel said, we were watched from inside, The breach was expected. The narrator said. Sky Turner pulled her hood tighter, her voice cracking with fear. Evelyn Drake said, fear is useful, it sharpens choices. The narrator said. The SUV reappeared, headlights cutting through the rain like knives. Maya Collins said, then the betrayal already sits at our table. The narrator said. The night closed in, pressing its weight into the narrow walls. Daniel Reyes said, we do not stop, not until the truth outpaces them. The narrator said, every drop of rain felt heavier, like a verdict already written. The narrator said, the courtroom thrummed with anticipation, its walls swollen with whispers. Maya Collins said, this is not justice yet, only theater. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes stacked files neatly, his composure a shield of ritual. Jonah Patel said, every eye's a camera, every silence a microphone. The narrator said, Sky Turner sat near the back, her sketchbook balanced on her knees like contraband. Evelyn Drake said, trials are stages, and I never enter a stage without knowing the ending. The narrator said, Maya felt the air vibrate with truths pressed under perjury. Daniel Reyes said, we push until cracks show, then we strike. The narrator said, the judge's gavel lay dormant, yet its weight pressed every chest. Sky Turner said, faces lie, but my lines do not. The narrator said, Maya gripped the folder, her pulse steady though her heart broke open. The narrator said, the witness stand groaned as truth wrestled with fear. Maya Collins said, answer the question directly, without ornaments. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes adjusted his glasses, voice slicing sharp as a scalpel. Jonah Patel said, watch their hands, tremors always betray memory. The narrator said, Sky Turner sketched the witness mid-stutter, her pencil scratching louder than whispers. Evelyn Drake said, your memory is a performance, and I am its director. The narrator said. The gallery leaned forward, thirsting for revelation. Maya Collins said, the verdict is not born from silence, it is birthed from courage. The narrator said, sweat gathered on the witness' brow, falling like confessions. Daniel Reyes said, we are closer, but danger sharpens as we move. The narrator said, the air thickened, carrying both fear and hope. The narrator said, the cross-examination cut deeper than expected, revealing nerves like exposed wire. Maya Collins said, your records contradict themselves, which truth serves you best? The narrator said. Daniel Reyes leaned closer, anchoring the argument with precision. Jonah Patel said, the jury watches their every blink. The narrator said. Sky Turner tapped her pencil, capturing hesitation in graphite lines. Evelyn Drake said, truth is fragile, it shatters with the gentlest pressure. The narrator said, the gavel struck once, silencing murmurs and amplifying tension. Maya Collins said, we build not from faith, but from fracture. The narrator said, the witness swallowed hard, a pause that betrayed guilt. Daniel Reyes said, now the foundation wavers, and so does their case. The narrator said, the silence after was louder than thunder. The narrator said, the defense rose, silk smooth and dangerous. Evelyn Drake said, justice is a stage where truth rehearses but rarely performs. The narrator said. Maya Collins stiffened, sensing venom beneath polished words. Daniel Reyes said, do not let cadence replace evidence. The narrator said. Jonah Patel gripped his pen until the cap cracked. Sky Turner said, her voice is clean, but her shadow is not. The narrator said. The jury shifted uneasily, pulled by charm and hidden wires. Maya Collins said, justice bends only if we allow its spine to break. The narrator said. The judge raised a hand, keeping order barely intact. Evelyn Drake said, control belongs to those who write the final line. The narrator said, the courtroom became a battlefield, where silence carried the heaviest weapons. The narrator said, the climax crashed like a wave, unstoppable and violent. Maya Collins said, this folder holds not claims, but proof carved in permanence. The narrator said. Daniel Reyes laid the documents before the judge, steady as stone. Jonah Patel said, This is the crack that cannot be patched. The narrator said. Sky Turner flipped her sketchbook, showing the jury drawings that echoed evidence. Evelyn Drake said, perception bends easier than fact, but even I cannot unmake this. The narrator said. The jury leaned forward, faces lit by revelation. Maya Collins said, Lila's truth was never absent, only buried. The narrator said, the gavel struck, the sound a thunderclap across decades of silence. Daniel Reyes said, now the wall collapses. The narrator said, the air erupted, half relief, half dread of what came next. The narrator said, the verdict echoed like thunder, shaking marrow and memory. Maya Collins said, we fought for this, but justice is never clean. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes exhaled deeply, his hand pressing the documents into final rest. Jonah Patel said, the cracks in their case were fatal, yet danger still stalks us. The narrator said, Sky Turner's eyes brimmed with tears, her pencil trembling above the page. Evelyn Drake said, victory is only the first illusion. Loss waits behind the curtain. The narrator said, the gallery erupted with clashing voices, some triumphant, some broken. Maya Collins said, Lilas. Silence is no longer unanswered. The narrator said, the gavel struck again, final and unyielding. Daniel Reyes said, this was truth reclaimed, but truth has its own costs. The narrator said, the courtroom became a mausoleum of secrets set free. The narrator said, outside the courthouse steps were slick with rain and protest. Maya Collins said, their cheers do not heal what remains undone. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes adjusted his coat, eyes scanning for threats in the crowd. Jonah Patel said, we expose them, but exposure makes us prey. The narrator said, Sky Turner clutched her sketchbook, shielding it as though it carried her soul. Evelyn Drake said, truth in daylight blinds more than it guides. The narrator said, reporters shouted, microphones thrust forward like weapons. Maya Collins said, words will not save us, actions must carry the weight. The narrator said, a siren wailed in the distance, folding into chants of justice. Daniel Reyes said, every victory makes a new enemy. The narrator said, the storm held off, but its promise lingered in the heavy air. The narrator said, the safehouse lamp burned low, casting tired shadows across the room. Maya Collins said, justice was declared, but peace remains absent. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes shuffled papers into a sealed envelope, his movements deliberate. Jonah Patel said, we must secure this, or they will erase it before sunrise. The narrator said, Sky Turner drew Lila's face again, lines sharper, as though memory hardened. Evelyn Drake said, memory is clay, and every hand reshapes it to survive. The narrator said, Maya traced the scar on her palm, the old wound pulsing alive. Daniel Reyes said, we will hand this to someone untouched by fear. The narrator said, rain streaked the window, a curtain between them and the city. Jonah Patel said, trust is thin, but it is all we carry. The narrator said, the silence swelled, broken only by the scratching of pencil on paper. The narrator said, the river bent again under moonlight, same place, new weight. Maya Collins said, this was where it began, and where it must end. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes unfolded a copy of the evidence, edges curling with damp. Jonah Patel said, we burn the duplicate, keep only one trail alive. The narrator said, Sky Turner held her sketchbook open, showing drawings of both past and present. Evelyn Drake said, fire cleanses, but also conceals. Remember which path you choose. The narrator said, Maya hesitated, staring at the flames licking higher. Daniel Reyes said, ash cannot testify, but it cannot betray either. The narrator said, the night wrapped around them, the river whispering secrets below. Sky Turner said, Lila's shadow is still here, I can feel it. The narrator said, the fire roared, consuming proof and doubt alike. The narrator said, the city skyline flickered with restless lights, distant and watchful. Maya Collins said, justice is not victory, it is survival. The narrator said. Daniel Reyes leaned on the railing, exhaustion pooling in his shoulders. Jonah Patel said, enemies regroup faster than allies celebrate. The narrator said. Sky Turner closed her sketchbook, pressing it to her heart like a relic. Evelyn Drake said, you think tonight ended, but the story is only half written. The narrator said, Maya looked into the river, its dark current carrying Lila's ghost. Daniel Reyes said, if this was the cost, then we pay it and keep moving. The narrator said. Jonah exhaled, the sound like surrender and resolve entwined. Sky Turner said, Lila is not gone, she is threaded into everything now. The narrator said, the night breathed heavy, holding the weight of all that survived. The narrator said, the night dragged into dawn, pale light spilling across wet stone. Maya Collins said, justice tastes bitter, yet it keeps us breathing. The narrator said. Daniel Reyes leaned against a wall, shoulders bent beneath unseen weight. Jonah Patel said, enemies lurk still, their silence louder than applause. The narrator said. Sky Turner flipped her sketchbook shut, eyes heavy with knowledge too sharp for her years. Evelyn Drake said, stories do not end, they simply wait for the next voice. The narrator said, the city yawned awake, indifferent to truths fought for in its shadows. The narrator said, the safe house was nearly bare, its walls holding echoes instead of secrets. Maya Collins said, we walked through fire, yet the ashes cling still. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes sealed the final envelope, sending truth into exile. Jonah Patel said, guard it well, for paper bleeds faster than flesh. The narrator said, Sky Turner carved Lila's name into the corner of her notebook. Evelyn Drake said, the strongest ghosts are the ones we invite to stay. The narrator said, a clock ticked steady, marking time they could no longer own. The narrator said, the cemetery lay quiet, grass slick with dew. Maya Collins said, Lila deserved more than silence carved in stone. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes placed a single white rose, his jaw locked tight. Jonah Patel said, the dead ask for nothing, but the living owe them everything. The narrator said, Sky Turner sketched the headstone, her lines trembling but true. Evelyn Drake said, graves are mirrors showing only the faces of the living. The narrator said, wind carried the faint scent of rain, mingling with memory. The narrator said, the diner hummed again, neon glow softer in the early hours. Maya Collins said, we survived, but survival is not victory. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes stirred his coffee without drinking, lost in thought. Jonah Patel said, we will not be remembered, only the truths we carried. The narrator said, Sky Turner flipped her sketchbook, showing faces of those now gone. Evelyn Drake said, legacy is not truth, legacy is arrangement. The narrator said, outside, the city pulsed, its noise indifferent to quiet reckonings. The narrator said, the river bent one last time beneath twilight, carrying secrets into its endless current. Maya Collins said, we risked everything, yet the truth feels incomplete. The narrator said, Daniel Reyes lit a cigarette, smoke curling like questions unanswered. Jonah Patel said, justice is temporary, survival is permanent. The narrator said, Sky Turner placed her sketchbook on the railing, pages fluttering into the dark. Evelyn Drake said, some truths are meant to haunt, not to heal. The narrator said, the wind shifted, carrying a whisper that felt like Lila's name.